Hello and welcome to BMCC Online. I am Justin. I'm your host today. We're so glad that you could make it here today. Today is Palm Sunday, the beginning of Holy Week. Pastor Jim is going to be talking to us today kind of about the events that went on Palm Sunday. So we'll just sit back and I'll check in on you afterwards.
When it's a family member, a father or a mother, a sibling, grandparent, they hurt you. But they were the ones who were supposed to protect you. They were the ones who were supposed to be on your side no matter what, come hell or high water. Do they say that anymore? Come hell or high water, they were supposed to be there on your side. But they chose the other side instead. It's a terrible thing. So, it was Easter Sunday a long time ago when I didn't know you yet, so you don't know any of the characters in the story except for me. But we had been invited. Actually, there's Leslie, you know her. She was invited too, and our kids, they were invited. Anyway, I digress. We were invited to a friend's house after church on Easter Sunday. And this friend, they had kids about the same age as ours, and the kids were all small at the time. And so we thought, yeah, that'd be great. Our family is far away. We'll go with you and have Easter lunch with you. And so we planned to have Easter lunch with this friend of ours. And Easter Sunday, church came in, and before we left to go to the friend's house for that lunch, she pulled me aside and she said, now there's something I need to tell you about my family. There's something, you might notice a strange dynamic in our home today. And the thing is this, and it's a little embarrassing. The thing is this, my mom had an affair with my sister's husband. Whoa. Wow, that's heavy. That is really heavy. Now, it came out, everybody knows about it, and they're working through it. And but just so you know, my mom and dad are going to be there, and my sister and her husband will be there, and their kids, and of course, my family, and your family. And we're thinking, wow, that's incredible. And so we went, and we made light conversation, and we hunted for Easter eggs. And we had lunch, and we got out of there as quick as we could. And we did, and you laugh, but I'll tell you what, the pain in that home was palpable because of that betrayal, and you could feel it. It was devastated, and there's some betrayals that I don't know if there's a way to come back from for that family. I don't know if there's healing really that can take place, because that's a betrayal where a mom betrayed her daughter by having an affair with her husband. I don't know. I don't know if it's possible. Some of you have experienced betrayal on that level. I mean, that's not your story, I hope. But if it is your story, that's devastating. That kind of betrayal, it just cuts so deep. How do you come back from that? How do you overcome something like that? Betrayal, it's intensely personal. Someone who's supposed to be with you chose the other side instead. We wish sometimes that we could point our fingers at people, say, it's you, it's you, it's you. But you know what they say, if you point your finger, there's 3 pointing back at you, assuming you have 4 fingers. Jesus entered the city that day, a couple thousand years ago. And as he entered the city, the people were thrilled because they'd seen him multiply bread and fish and feed thousands of people. They'd seen him cast out demons. They'd seen him heal the lame, restore sight to the blind. They heard him teach with authority that they had never seen in their lives. They heard him confront all of the religious leaders and oppose them and accuse them of the things that the people knew already, that their hearts were far from God. And now Jesus is coming into the city. And as he's coming, it's almost Passover time. As he's coming into the city, he's on the back of a donkey. And he's led by his disciples. And it's a small parade. And that small parade pretty quickly turns into a big parade. And he's coming in on the back of a donkey, and it seems humble, but it's not exactly humble. There's a message behind this parade that's coming into town. When a king came in a time of peace in this area of the world, when a king came in a time of peace, he rode a donkey. If he came in a time of war, he rode a horse, a charger. And so he comes in peace as a king. And they saw him, and they cried out, Hosanna, which means save now. And they laid palm branches in front of him, and they took off their cloaks and laid them out, and they cried, save now, Hosanna, Hosanna. And they were, in effect, crying, he is the Messiah. He's the Messiah. And so they were crying out to him, save us. He rode right down to the temple and walked in, and there in the temple he sees the money changers ripping off the people, and he forms a whip and he flips over the money changers' tables and chases them out. And he says, you have made my father's house into a den of thieves. So he confronts them, and suddenly everything changed. Now, there was always hostility between Jesus and the religious leaders, always. But now it was a new level. Now the people had turned to him and they're trying to make him the king, the Messiah. They're trying to put him on the throne. And he had just taken away their authority as religious leaders and their prophet as religious leaders. And they knew they've got to get rid of this guy. It's gone too far. We've got to take him out. And so Jesus continually, in the book of Matthew chapter 23, Jesus continues for the next couple of days to confront these religious leaders. Here's an example of this confrontation, Matthew 23:27. Jesus says, what sorrow awaits you, teachers of the religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but filled on the inside with dead people's bones and all sorts of impurity. Outwardly, you look like righteous people, but inwardly, your hearts are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness. He called them hypocrites. On the inside, in your heart, it's hypocrisy and lawlessness. Hypocrites, you're like whitewashed tombs. Interestingly, during Passover, the tombs around Jerusalem were whitewashed. They painted them basically with a whitewash so that as people came for the Passover, you wouldn't accidentally sit down and set out your picnic and lean up against a tomb and so disqualify yourself for worship during the Passover. And so they whitewashed the tombs so you knew where they were, and they were beautiful. It's like walking through the cemetery. Sometimes there's nothing more beautiful than a cemetery. And yet, they're filled with death, and everything vile. So pause there just a second. Have you ever been hypocritical? I don't see very many hands. Anybody? Yeah, right? Have you ever been hypocritical? Have you ever claimed that your motives were pure? That you were right? That the reason you were doing this was a good reason? Yet on the inside, you kind of knew your motives weren't really pure, right? And yes, you kind of had put it all together, but you're really filled with anger and hatred, or maybe lies. Maybe it wasn't lies, maybe it was just half-truths, right? Have you ever allowed yourself to become bitter? Have you ever allowed yourself to become vengeful? If you notice, my voice is a little shaky today. Yesterday, I didn't even have a voice, so anyway. Have you ever been motivated by greed and selfishness? Jesus equates those kind of things that are going on inside of our hearts. He equates that with having dead men's bones and everything vile and rotten inside of us. He looks at us and he says, what's happening in our heart matters. Now, you had the right to feel that way. You had the right to allow that bitterness or that hatred or greed or those motives to take root. And you have every right as a human. But God looks at that in us, and he knows what it's doing to us, and he sees it's transforming us from the inside. And God hates that stuff. Now, I didn't say God hates you. He doesn't hate you. He loves you deeply, passionately. He loves you so much that he's willing to do anything to make the relationship with you and he right. And yet God hates this thing that we have given over in our hearts sometimes. And so there's all this rot taking place. And those are just to name a few. Luke chapter 22, verse 2. Now the religious leaders, they're ready to find a way to get rid of Jesus. But there's a problem. The people are for him. And so Luke 22, verse 2. The leading priests and the teachers of the religious law were plotting how to kill Jesus. But they were afraid of the people's reaction. Then Satan entered into Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12 disciples. And he went to the leading priests and the captains of the temple guard to discuss the best way to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted, and they promised to give him money. So he agreed and began looking for the opportunity to betray Jesus so they could arrest him when the crowds weren't around. What does it mean, Satan entered Judas? What does that mean? Does that mean that Judas was possessed by Satan like Jesus had cast demons out of people? Was Judas possessed by Satan? I don't think that's the implication here. But for some reason, here's the reason I don't think that was the implication. Because Judas is still in control of himself. When somebody is possessed by a demon, they're not in control. But Judas seems to be in control here. Possessed, no. Every person on earth, all of us, we have a choice. We can be used as an instrument of God for good, to do good in the world, to build up, to bless. Or we can be used by Satan to do evil in the world, or to destroy what is good and right, to tear down and to curse. And we're constantly being recruited by God to do good in the world, and by Satan to do evil. And there's this battle that takes place. And you know where the battle's taking place? In me, in my heart, in your heart. It's the war that's taking place in us. 2 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 9. We see God speaking to Asa. He says, "The eyes of the Lord search the whole earth in order to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him." So our hearts are being tested all the time. Who will we serve? So Satan enters Judas Iscariot. William Barclay writes, Satan could not have entered Judas unless Judas had opened the door. There is no handle on the outside of the door of the human heart. It must be opened from within. That's an incredible thought. There's no handle on the outside of the human heart. And that's true. Nobody can get into your heart unless you allow them into your heart. A person, you don't have to allow a person into your heart, but sometimes you open your heart to a person and allow them in. Now, the same thing is true with God. God can't get in your heart unless you open the door to God. And Satan can't get into our hearts either unless we open the door to our heart. We live in a society now that has rejected God, the God of the Bible. Our society, especially in the Pacific Northwest, but in our society, less and less are we a society that's a Christian nation and that kind of thing. That's just not where we are anymore. We have rejected God. It shouldn't surprise us that if we shut our hearts to God, that we see all kinds of awful things come out. We see violence, we see hatred, we see greed, we see the things that we see. That shouldn't be a surprise to us because those are things that take root in our heart. And when we reject God and shut our hearts to God, those things grow in us. If we allow our minds and our hearts to go to dark places, don't be surprised when darkness takes root in us. And so Proverbs 4:23 tells us this: guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. Guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. Does that mean live with a guarded heart? No, not exactly. That doesn't mean don't let anybody in your heart. That doesn't mean that. You've known people who are just so guarded that you can't even get close to them. It's not what it's saying. Guard your heart against other people. It's not guarding your heart so that you're not going to be vulnerable. It's just this: be careful what you embrace. Be careful what you give your heart over to. Be careful what you allow to grow in your heart, because it does determine the course of our lives. It determines what we become. It determines the causes that we fight for or we fight against. So the gospel according to John gives us a peek into the heart of Judas, the betrayer. And we get this peek a little bit before Jesus goes to the cross, before the events occurred that we've already started to read about. And so Jesus is reclining at the home of Mary and Martha. And Mary comes to Jesus and she has perfume and she pours it on his feet, and then she begins to wipe the perfume off of his feet with her hair. And so this text, John 12, verse 4. But Judas Iscariot, the disciple who would soon betray him, said, the perfume was worth a year's wages. It should have been sold and the money given to the poor. Not that he cared for the poor. He was a thief. And since he was in charge of the disciples' money, he often stole some for himself. So we see a little bit about Judas's heart, right? We see a little bit about who he was. His heart was open to greed and theft, dishonesty. He let those things take root in his heart. Here's the thing. We can open our hearts to Satan without even realizing it. We can open our hearts to the things that are wrong and not even realize, hey, I've opened my heart to Satan. I mean, that sounds, is anybody's heart open to Satan? No. But we open our heart to all kinds of things that can give the devil a foothold in our lives. So fast forward, Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is praying at the garden. Judas has already agreed to betray Jesus. Jesus is praying at the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's posted the disciples, and he says, watch and pray. Watch that you don't fall into temptation. You stay here and pray. And he went further into the garden to pray. And as he's there, he prays, and he's in tremendous agony. Then Luke chapter 22, verse 42 tells us the story. Father, this is Jesus' prayer. Father, if you're willing, please take this cup of suffering away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine. Then an angel from heaven appeared and strengthened him. He prayed more fervently, and he was in such agony of spirit that his sweat fell to the ground like great drops of blood. I think it's a little bit strange to ponder the part that Judas played in Jesus' agony that day. You know, that Judas, he didn't have to play the part. He could have allowed somebody else to play that part. He didn't have to be the one to betray Jesus. But he played that part. This man who had promised to be a disciple of Christ, he was going to shape his life after Jesus. He was going to be a reflection of who Jesus was. And yet, he betrayed him. Verse 47, picking up in Luke 22. But even as Jesus said this, a crowd approached, led by Judas, one of the 12 disciples. Judas walked over to Jesus to greet him with a kiss. But Jesus said, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? See, the garden was the secret place. This was the place that Jesus retreated to. This was the place where after doing battle, if you will, with all the religious leaders, after teaching and preaching, after healing, after doing all of this, he could retreat to the garden and pray. But Judas knew the secret place. Judas knew exactly where to find Jesus at that time of night. Judas knew where they would be, and so he agreed to take the religious leaders, the guards, there. Judas knew the place because he was in the inner circle. And he walked up, and he was followed by all of these soldiers, all of these temple guards. And he walked up, and he kissed Jesus. A kiss is an incredibly intimate thing, right? To kiss somebody. I mean, how many of you did I kiss this morning? None of you, right? I mean, yeah, we don't do that really, but this would be the way that a disciple would greet a beloved rabbi. He would walk up out of honor, out of respect, and he would kiss his cheek to show love and devotion. But you know what was not there? Love or devotion. Judas' heart was set somewhere else. He pretended to be a friend, but he was not a friend. Have you ever had somebody pretend to be your friend, and they were really just after something else? That's what was going on here. Maybe Judas believed that it would play out differently. Maybe Judas believed that things would turn out for the best, that it would all... We don't know what he was really thinking in his decision-making. Here are the hallmarks of betrayal. Okay? Here are the hallmarks. You justify your actions. You justify them. It's wrong, and you know it's wrong, but you've justified it. You have worked out your rationale. You've worked it out. You see, in every other case, it's wrong, but in this case, because of A, because of B, and because of C, it's okay for me to do this. In any other case, it would be wrong, but because of these reasons, it's okay to do this. The hallmark of betrayal. We find a way to justify the whole thing. Inside, he knew it was wrong. So what I want us to do, if you can, put yourself in Judas' spot for a minute. Imagine you're the betrayer. You are the one who betrayed a significant relationship. Jesus was taken away. He was taken and placed on trial. It was an illegal trial because it took place in the middle of the night. Trial was never to take place after dark. And he was convicted. He was mocked and beaten in the face. And then they took him to Pilate the next morning, and they had him beaten again. And he was sentenced to death, and he was flogged, and he was hung on the cross. And during the trial, Peter, one of the disciples, Peter was placed on the spot. Do you know him? Your voice sounds like you're a Galilean. You know him. You're one of his disciples, right? And Peter would say, I don't even know the man. Peter thought nobody was looking. I don't even know the man. Let me ask this. Was that betrayal? I don't know the man. I don't know. It doesn't feel as bad as selling Jesus for money. Is it betrayal or is it self-preservation? I don't know. But we do know this. Peter felt devastated by denying Christ. He felt devastated. And he would regret this with every fiber of his being. Judas, we know, if he had to do it over again, wouldn't have done it. You know how we know it? Because the money that he was paid, he tried to take it back and give it back to the people who paid him. And they wouldn't take it. They said, we don't want your blood money. And so Judas went off and hung himself out of grief and remorse. When Jesus rose from the dead on Easter, and I'm giving things away for next Sunday. When Jesus rose from the dead, do you know what he did? He forgave Peter. He forgave him. He forgave Peter. He went to him and forgave him. I have a feeling that the Easter story could have ended differently for Judas if Judas had just hung on another day or two. I have a feeling that Jesus' grace could even have forgiven betrayal. I mean, I described a family situation that I don't think there's any way a family survives that, but I'll tell you what, the grace of Jesus seems to be bigger than our betrayal. It's like somehow it's more powerful, but that's not the way it ended. But if he could hang on the cross and look at the people who were cursing him, who had placed him there, and say to them, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. If he could say that to them, I wonder what he would have said to Judas. I bet you he would have said, I forgive you. The moral of this story, guard your heart. Guard your heart. Don't open it to darkness. Guard your heart. Don't allow things to grow in your heart that give birth to death. Don't allow it. Bitterness, greed, hatred, all that stuff, don't allow it in there. And I know you have to work it out. And I know we have to give that stuff over to Jesus and allow him to burn it out of us. But the funny thing about darkness is it can't stand the light. It can't. And so if we allow Jesus to shine his light into our hearts, search me, O God, know my heart. See if there's anything in me that displeases you. Guard your heart. Finally, if you have betrayed, take it to Jesus, because he knows what to do with it. If you have betrayed, take it to Jesus, because he dealt with it on the cross. He dealt with our sin on the cross, and he knows what to do with it. I want to pray. Maybe you can pray along silently with me if you like. Lord, when we have opened our hearts to darkness, please forgive us. Burn away the darkness with the light of your face, and help us guard our hearts from the things that bring rot inside of us. Instead, may we be open to you and to life and to love. If we have betrayed you or others, we ask for your forgiveness. Help make Help us make it right as far as we can. And we trust the rest into your merciful hands. Amen.
That was a great message by Jim. So glad that you guys could join us today. If you call BMCC Online your home, I encourage you to continue the act of worship through the giving of your tithes. You can do so over at bluemountainchurch.com. Up in the top of the webpage, there is a give button if you'd like to give there. Let me leave you with this blessing today. May you remember that God's grace is enough. May you remember that even when we betrayed Jesus with our words and actions, he still embraces us with open arms. May you remember that Jesus is the only hope this world has ever known. Have a great day and a wonderful week.